Welcome to Compliance Therapy with Igor Volovich, presented by Qmulos. Qmulos, converged continuous compliance. Get it together.
Compliance therapy, compliance strategy, these are things that we're talking about. And I think you hit the nail on the head with the culture change, right? The idea that a lot of the conversations that we tend to have, and I think the conversation that you and I are having is really, I mean, we've barely touched on technology. We've kind of stayed at layer 8, 9, and 10. We're talking about culture, organizational, financial, risk. And these are things that really, operate more at that executive level, at the leadership level. And I think that's where a lot of that change needs to happen because, look, an average ISO or, some person working in a SOC, they're not going to be able to drive that change. They can certainly influence some of the ideas and they can certainly kind of have some of that grassroots initiative happening within the orgs, but ultimately the change has to happen at the top. And the folks need to recognize that the value of compliance is not just in securing the revenue pipeline, making sure that they can continue to accept contracts and execute these business relationships, which is certainly a factor. Right?
Absolutely.
I've certainly been in places where you're not compliant, you can't do business, somebody pulls a contract and then your 20% of your revenue is now impacted. Yeah. These are real concerns, no doubt about it. But there's a conversation also about, the ROI of your investments. And you talked about that. And I'm really glad that you mentioned it because a lot of folks have trouble. And you said, I think the way you put it is we flog ourselves over this issue of, how do we demonstrate ROI? That's an ever-present question for every CISO out there. Show me at the level of a single control, I just spent $20 million on this new thing, which is shiny and beautiful and wonderful, and everybody talks about it, and Gartner put it in the right upper hand quadrant. Everybody wants it. We've got validation across the board, but then I put it in, or I tried to put it in, and 3 years later, I can't demonstrate any return on that value, on that investment. And the question is, could you have predicted that ahead of time? And I think what you walked us through just now, map it to a set of controls, figuring out, take that 853A, get that decomposed control set, and look at it. And look at it with the vendor. And then guess what? You want to go a step further? Bring in an auditor. Bring in an assessor. Look, if you're going to spend $20 million, spend $20,000 and bring somebody in to look at it. In fact, absolutely, if your vendor is not putting that up front and saying, hey, we get it. We understand what you actually need because we understand your business. We understand the kind of obligations that you're under. And by the way, we also understand they're going to change. So today you might have, CMMC. Tomorrow, who knows? M2131 came out. Now you got to have continuous monitoring. Now you got to have automated log collection. You got to have it real time, or as near real time as you can get. Show me on the doll, right? Show me on the standard where the thing is going to hurt me and how you guys solve that problem, how you close the gap, my compliance gap, not just from a individual control perspective, but from an overall meta quality, the metric being the overall governance of my compliance program. Show me that, right? And I think as clients become more informed through conversations like these, I have a good feeling about it. I think we can see kind of the future developing a little different, like evolving, not just evolving our compliance posture, but actually evolving the way we think about compliance.
Sure. Yeah.
I think that's really what it's about.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that a good example of this is the difference in people's opinion of NIST 853 and the NIST cybersecurity framework. People treat the NIST cybersecurity framework as the gold standard of how to measure a program. And it is just the 853 controls categorized into the categories that map in the NIST CSF. I mean, if you look at how they're broken down, they all trace back to 853 controls. I mean, they trace to CIS and other ones, but for the most part, the rule of thumb is that the average 853 control will encompass most other controls from other standards. They're just bigger, right? They're just more detailed. But if you were to hand somebody 853, they were like, "Blah, compliance, it's terrible." You hand them CSF, and they go, "That's what I'm talking about." And so, what
do you think is the difference? What do you think is the big?
Well, I think the difference is that the fundamental philosophy of NIST and the Joint Task Force that have engineered 853 has been to prioritize flexibility and universality at all costs. So, like I said, if you go back into first of all, nobody reads regulations. Definitely nobody reads 853 for the most part. And I haven't met anybody else who has a hobby of reading previous versions of 853. So I know that this is going to sound crazy, but just stick with me, right? If you go back into previous versions of 853, they are, for the most part, more specific than the current versions that we have now. So the trend over time has been not only are there more controls and there's more stuff in the controls, but they are also more nebulous. They are less specific. And so the CSF basically took this raw material, the sort of inert raw material, and just twisted it a half turn to the left and said, here's a way to categorize this giant blob of stuff. I mean, 853 by design, if you read the beginning of it, says the order of the families, access control to, to awareness and training, to whatever they happen to be. There is no implication that one is more important than the other. There is no insinuation that one is better than the other. Even the controls within the families themselves, they say they are ordered purely in alphabetical, alphanumeric order. They are not sequenced in priority or importance or sequence or anything. It is a as vanilla toolbox as possible. The CSF effectively took all the tools and put them into different buckets. I mean, it really didn't reinvent the wheel all that much. It just added a little bit of context to 853, and people go, oh my God, that's amazing. Like, this is an amazing revolution. And you go, guys, it's the same thing. It's the same thing. And so even with that little bit of energy put into taking those controls and making them more understandable, change the game. Everybody goes, the CSF is a great way a great set of lenses to evaluate your program. So imagine if we twist it like another half turn to the left and then speed it up. People will go, this is great. And so maybe they'll never admit that it is still the controls in the original document, which are sort of on purpose, not easy to deal with. It's designed, the way the metaphor that I use is 800-171 is derived from 853. So if 853 is a toolbox, 800-171 is a set of mismatched screwdrivers. Now, that's hilarious, unless all you needed was a set of screwdrivers to turn specific screws. If you use those screwdrivers to try to open a can of paint or put a roof on your house or build a foundation, you're going to go, man, this tool isn't very good for this.
This sucks.
And you're going to go, yeah, that's a screwdriver. That's not what that's for. So, but it's
not a chisel.
Yeah, it's not a chisel. And a lot of people just pick those screwdrivers up and start chiseling away, and they go, this is not working very well. Which, I mean, that's trite and funny, but I think it's a good way of seeing what happened. I mean, we took the screwdrivers out of the box and we labeled them with the CSF, and it helped people understand it a little bit better. So I think there are indications that there's some stuff here that we can salvage from the domain of compliance, whatever that means. Mm-hmm. So I don't think that it's too late, and I don't think that we have exhausted all of our options, because what's funny about the CSF is it relates to the controls, but it doesn't relate to 53A. So you say, hey, if you like that, you're going to love 53A. And people go, well, I don't know about that. And then we get back to the assurance piece, right? So it all eventually comes back around. But I just think that there's more to explore here.
I agree. Yeah, I mean, I think what you're talking about with the CSF versus 853 is NIST made it consumable. It made it accessible. It made it more marketable, I guess. Folks were able to connect with it a lot easier, and it didn't get lost in the slog of, what compliance in a bad way, right?
We put the medicine in the applesauce, right? And you're like, man, I love applesauce. You're like, okay, I mean, if you're taking the medicine, I don't care. It doesn't matter to me. But it sort of implies to NIST and to PCI and to cloud security, to anybody that is developing controls. Maybe we need more applesauce. It isn't the medicine's problem, right? So
yeah, I think, and I agree with this completely. And I think probably things like convergence and things like automation, kind of not to be repetitive about it, but I think if we look at these programs and we talk about how folks have a hard time thinking about them, understanding them, implementing them, and then deriving value out of them, how do we shorten the cycle on all those things, right? How do we get them to buy into the idea where it's not just a thing you have to do, right? But more of, we have to do it. And there's extra value we can get out of it because guess what? It gives us a consistent model for looking at the risk, consistent model for looking at our controls, also understanding the value and the ROI we're getting from these control investments, right? So it's not just a technology solution, but it's really, what is it doing for me from a risk perspective? And that's a big question that everybody wants to know, from the CFO to the CTO, CIO, and the CISO themselves. They want to be able to answer that question.
Yeah.
A lot of them don't know how to ask that question because they don't have a way to value these controls from a risk perspective. They just know they got to have them. Of course, we have to have an antivirus. Of course, we have to have an endpoint detection and response. Of course, we have to have a firewall or the equivalent of that in the cloud. Of course. Right. But maybe there is a better way to look at it and make these decisions from a risk perspective, truly, right? Not just from best of breed, whatever is in Gartner or 451 Research or Forrester Wave, and it's less about technology and more about risk, how it's supposed to be.
Yeah.
And then you take just half a step to the side from that and you say, well, let me look at my value generating activities and map them to my business and then understand what the priorities are. So we don't have to be talking about having these tired conversations about crown jewels, right?
Right.
And everybody's definition of what that means as you go from place to place. Look, I've been in places where they send out a survey every 6 months to all the senior VPs and say, show me your crown jewels. And they list out a thing. It's all this last minute scramble. And then you come back with this, kit and caboodle. This quilt of God knows what. And then you go, okay, now let's go ahead and prioritize them. And let's figure out where we have duplication. That takes another 6 months. Yep. And then guess what? It's time for another survey. And then we go again. And then where are we managing risk in all of this? Nowhere, right? So, but we're making a theater of security.
You're doing stuff. Right?
It's like TSA, right? It's there. And everybody hates it, and it's supposed to be there, and we don't know why anymore.
Right.
And it's been 20 odd years, and we get it, and not to be derisive to our friends in blue, but the reality is, it's hard to understand the value of it. And by the way, we also know anytime we try to send a fake bomb through TSA. And 95% of the time goes
right,
whatever the number is, right? And again, not
it's an interesting, it's an interesting phenomenon that
But what do we get out of it?
Right. You look at security and compliance in the physical domain. You look at it in the sort of standard cybersecurity domain. You look at compliance in the financial domain of just auditing, right? Just financial auditing and statements. There's all of these traps that you can fall into, and so it's just. Like I said, it's just one of those things that I go back to all the time where I'm like, the fact that it is not working as well as it could, triggers my curiosity into wondering, why is it not working? Is it a problem with the psychology around it? Is it a problem with technology? Is it a problem with the standards? Is it all of those things? And if those are the problems, is there a solution or is it permanent? And I don't know enough yet. I don't think anybody knows. The indications to me are that it is not a permanent feature of compliance, that it is just a useless, complete waste of time, because assurance is not a complete waste of time. Checklists are not inherently bad. And verification and test is a very important part of making sure that the plane takes off instead of just falling apart. And so when you look at compliance as, a cousin to all of those ideas, there's a lot of value here that we're not extracting, and it's going to take, great solutions and interested people and, people smarter than I am to look at the problem and say, that maybe this is the solution. We're just going to have to bang on it for a while and see how to fix it. But it's almost like, the technology arms race just took off in terms of, the how the world evolved, and the GRC part is lagging behind. Now, that's okay, right? It's
abandoned by most, by the way.
Absolutely. And it's there's so many reasons that go into why that's true, but I just, for some reason, just can't stop nerding out over why that is. For instance, right? I know that we're getting, somewhat short on time, but, in the CMMC space, one of the things that I never got bored with that little domain of compliance and regulatory compliance, because I would see people and they would pick up this standard and they go, I have no idea what this means. And then you would go watch a webinar or talk to folks at NIST or at the government, and they would feel very confident in what 171 was designed to do. And then you go back and work with clients and go, I have no idea what this means. And that gap in the middle, I was just like, why is this? How is that possible? Like, what's the missing piece here? And now 3 years later, after doing all this investigation and research and trying to put all the pieces together, you're like, oh, there are assumptions at play. There are economics at play. There are other factors at play. Human psychology is at play. The technology is a factor at play. There's all of these ingredients that are mixing together. And because compliance is icky and hard, you go where there is less resistance. And that is technology. That is cool guy stuff. That is beating up on compliance. That's the easy argument. However, like we said earlier, assurance is the name of the game moving forward, whether it's for insurance coverage, whether it's for supply chain agreements with upstream companies, whether it's for SEC reporting, whether it's for government-wide CUI protections, whether it's for privacy regulation. It's all a question of assurance. If it were just a technology problem, we wouldn't even be having this conversation.
Right. We would have solved it long ago.
Right. We don't have any, there's no lack of technology out there. It's the combination of technology and assurance that we need. Because like we said, when you don't have the technology piece and you're just pursuing assurance, that's when it's theater. That's when it's compliance as an epithet. That's when it's just a checklist. You got to merge those two things together, and we'll see what that looks like over time.
Yeah, it's certainly, I think the attention that we see on compliance now after all the breaches, Colonial Pipeline, all the things that happened last year, all of the grand move to the cloud, whether for folks who were ready or not ready, most of them not ready, and they accelerated that move, all the breaches that happened. Now the most prevalent breach entry point is cloud misconfiguration.
Yeah.
So that tells you something, right? So as things become more complex, the cloud was supposed to solve it, but we wound up with a lot of hybrid environments. A lot of things are crossing these chasms. Folks who weren't ready for it, whose controls were not ready for it. Now they're trying to do both on-prem, hybrid, in the cloud, all at the same time. And their data is everywhere, their clients are everywhere. And now the regulators are coming down and saying, look, we don't really care what your environment looks like. You got to comply. You got to demonstrate compliance.
Yeah, you got to give us some assurance that you have an idea of what's going on. I mean, to get back to the idea of doing, of evaluating your scope, what I tell people all the time when they're dealing with 171 and CMMC in the DoD space is they say, well, I've got this requirement, I've got this regulation. I don't really know what's what, so I'm going to get a gap assessment. You're like, well, a gap assessment implies that you know the scope that you're assessing and that you're evaluating the gaps within that scope. What you really need is a scope assessment, and that doesn't really have anything to do with the controls in the document. The controls in the document are predicated on the idea that you have an understanding of the data flow in your environment. And then we end up in this position where, okay, do we now wait for the regulators to say you have to do data flow analysis and have a data flow diagram and prescribe to you how to do it and what it needs to look like so you can check the box and then have done it? Or is it better for them to stay completely out of the way and not tell you those things? And for the most part, the current experiment in the DoD is that not telling people what they need to do is not working. And so as you add more controls, right, it compounds this effect of people focusing on the standard, and you end up with this weird sort of back and forth. So it is not a question of, oh, we just need to make, we need to make more controls or bring in more controls. But it's also not a question of, we just need to let me put it this way.
Do you suffer from seasonal compliance fatigue and chronic compliance headaches? You're not alone. Countless IT, compliance, and cybersecurity professionals just like you continue to suffer from legacy compliance, audit, and assessment workflows, excessive compliance paperwork, and manual evidence collection. Sadly, most have just accepted the idea that compliance management must always be difficult and unpleasant, but it doesn't have to be. Qmulos, an industry leader in converged continuous compliance, has developed revolutionary treatment options to relieve your compliance-related stress, delivering a fully automated end-to-end compliance experience. Don't delay. Call today for a free consultation with one of our compliance therapists and start your journey to converged continuous compliance by Qmulos. Call toll-free 1-844-476-8567 or visit Qmulos.com to start your healing journey. That's QMULOS.com. Qmulos, the compliance automation you need, the compliance experience you'll love.
If security were going to just emerge organically, if there were no requirements or regulation whatsoever, the defense industrial base would be one of the most secure sectors on the planet, because there has been no enforcement of security whatsoever in that sector, despite the fact that these companies have extremely sensitive data that they deal with on a regular basis. And you're talking about critical technological information that's export controlled, that very specific weapon system information in a lot of cases, clearly information that you wouldn't want to just disclose randomly. And for the most part, current statistics and things like that from reports like from GAO and from DoD indicate that 75 or 80% of the industrial base supply chain of the DoD has almost nothing in place whatsoever. So yeah, okay, there's a problem with compliance. It's not ideal. It is often more unhelpful than helpful because of the way it's designed. But for the argument to then say we should get rid of it is overall harmful to the goal of getting towards better security, right? And when we, corner ourselves into that reality, we go, well, now it's time to put in the hard work of figuring out how to make compliance better. People go, I'm going to go do other things because it's a hard problem. So,
well, yeah, I mean, you can go buy. Look, I think we all understand this too. You can go buy a bunch of technology, but you can't buy compliance anymore. You can buy security, but security tends to be technology tends to be more of a proxy for security, right? People get that. They go, well, I bought a security solution. By definition, I'm increasing my security posture and reducing my risk posture. For compliance, it's not that clear line, right? It's not as clear cut, right? So people go, I have all these investments. Ostensibly, I'm having better security. Whether or not I implemented the controls is a different story. And then full stop, pause. Let's talk about compliance as a separate thing, right?
Right.
No, you're looking at the same things. You're looking at the same infrastructure. You're looking at the same controls. Whether you recognize them as controls is a different story. Whether you collect telemetry from them from a security or compliance perspective, it's a semantic difference, but in the end, it is still telemetry from a piece of technology.
Yeah.
And if you're failing to recognize the value of converging those two views into a single, I hate to say single pane of glass, right? But if there is a way to think about it, maybe it's two sides of that same glass.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
Compliance on one of the
it's a one-way mirror.
Same thing. It's a reflection. Maybe it's a double-sided glass, right? And so and on the one hand, you get the reflection of it, and that reflection is a subset of your security picture, and that's called compliance, right? You're looking at a subset of things from a specific set of control frameworks, and then there is security underlying all of it, right? And all of it is under one big umbrella of risk and assurance, if you want to call it that, right? So
no, I agree. Yeah, I agree completely. I mean, it's that integrated, convergent idea is absolutely the way that things are moving and the way that it should be looked at. And I'm very excited to see what happens with the convergence project that you're working on. And I think and everybody listening probably knows that there are going to be people who get it, and then there are going to be people who they don't get it, and they're going to use the standards as a surrogate for success. They're going to use the standards as a surrogate for security. And there's probably not a lot that we can do about it, except try to facilitate it, try to make it better. And, from my perspective, try to influence the nature of the regulations more than, try to, lead a horse to water, right? I mean, it's going to take, there's, this idea that, in this sort of complex environment that we have, there's no broken piece, right? There's no broken gear that if we just fix that one piece, the whole machine will run, right? It's going to take all of these.
It's systemic.
Yeah, exactly. It's a complex system, and it has systemic issues, and it's going to take a bunch of tiny solutions all moving together over time to influence that system to change its behavior. And as of right now, I think compliance standards sometimes help. They sometimes hurt, moving the behavior of that system, but just to say that compliance inherently will always work against influencing the system in a positive way, I think is the wrong approach.
I couldn't agree more. Well, there's hope, And there is an evolution ahead of us, I think. I think we're moving in some kind of direction, hopefully the right direction. I think a lot more folks are becoming cognizant of the fact that we need to change the way we think about compliance. Certainly the regulations are coming out that say that explicitly.
Yeah.
You know, things like M2131, things like NSM 8, Executive Order 14028, CMMC. I think people are becoming a lot more cognizant also of how it's going to be applied now in the new world, right?
Yeah.
And everything that's post-COVID, everything that's post-colonial, you know, all these things are happening. Of course, the Ukrainian-Russian thing, we're not going to talk about that because we'll need another 2 hours just on that, but maybe another episode.
Yeah, absolutely.
But thank you again for coming to us and sharing this with our audience and with me and spending time with us. I know you're a busy guy and you're definitely out there a lot, very prolific content creator, and certainly an expert in the field of CMMC and just compliance in general. But what a great time I've certainly had, and I hope you enjoyed yourself as well. If you can tell our audience where they can find you online, to follow you and all the great content.
So I'm an easy guy to find on LinkedIn. The lucky part about working in the DoD field is that the majority of the conversation is focused on that one platform. So that's primarily where I spend most of my time. You can also find information on our blog at summit7.us. You can also use cmmc.blog or cmmc.video to find our YouTube page, where we put out a lot of video content around changes to CMMC, how that interfaces with the Microsoft ecosystem, things to know, things to watch for. We usually do a quarterly update on the regulatory landscape. So lots of resources, relatively easy to find, but I'm always hanging around on LinkedIn. So,
as do I.
Yeah.
That's where we find each other. Well, thanks again, Jacob. This was fascinating.
Yeah, it's a great conversation. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Yep. Bye.
See you soon.